Good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 1. I want to do a quick summary of Chapter 8 in your book, The American Yelp. And it's about the market revolution and things related to that era. Um, it's a very important chapter. It's not my favorite to really talk about and discuss. I think the book does a great job, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't punt and not do a video review of the things I think were important. Uh, we know when you think of the industrial revolution, that's what most people want to talk about in history, but they are preceded by sort of a runway of other revolutions related to the economy. We talked about the consumer revolution in previous chapters. Now it's the market revolution, and the economy advances significantly. Manufacturing methodologies changed. It's the birth of the factory right here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We know the Lowell system. The town of Lowell was named after a guy named Lowell when it was about the spinning and I shouldn't say spinning, but basically the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, that were often worked by young ladies uh, and managed by men, but still the industry was significant in that it changed the homespun goods. We became a nation of consumers, and less of us were making products at home. We were purchasing them. And it really changed the nature of the economy and really social structure in a lot of ways as well. So it brought us in new directions. Obviously, there was a huge growth of slavery in the South. The slavery dies of its own accord, mostly in the Northeast. I mean, New Jersey had it right up until the Civil War, but in terms of a large, important institution, it wasn't so much in the Northeast anymore, and it was banned in many communities, both on humanitarian levels, but also with the reality that the economic impulse of money making wasn't with slave industry in the Northeast. And what we call the term free labor means it's free to move. This sense of being an indentured worker or being under the old apprenticeship system where you'd often live in the same home sometimes as the master with carpenter. Well, I was going to say plumber, but they didn't have plumbers so much back then. But shoemaker or metal worker, ironsmiths, all these different kinds of careers that existed back then of skilled artisans, they would have this apprenticeship system where the apprentice would work for them on very low wages, but mostly room and board. But you got educated, but you were under the mandates and the structure of the master servant relationship. That changed. Now we have this free labor of mostly immigrants, significant number of poor immigrants, and the labor was less skilled. It was piecework, and you got trained to do a specific piece in a factory. And what the term free meant was you were free to go. You didn't have a contract. You work today, and maybe tomorrow you decide to do something else. Same for the employer. They could decide that they have a better employee to come in that's either cheaper or more efficient. And this was actually celebrated, and it's still, I think, celebrated in American ideology to this day, that the sense of being a poor, underpaid worker, there's a certain philosophical underpinning that that's okay because tomorrow I can advance and find a better job. And this is temporary. And I can one day be the owner of a company myself. That philosophy still is deeply embedded in the American psyche. I don't know how mobily upward we really are. We are to a certain degree. So it's not a totally invalid philosophy, but it was born during this era where significant amounts of poor labor is poured into the city structure because of the boom in immigration and the change in the way in which we manufacture goods. It's the new market revolution. So the developments, goods were for sale and not for consumption. I mean, we didn't do it mostly at a homespun level. We did it to basically go out in the market. And the market economy really grew, and as a result of that, classes started to become more structured. We weren't sort of this middling group of, there were some elite and wealthy, but the core of us were in the same sort of boat of wealth and prospects, if you will. Now this changed. We have a much more stratified society. There are still the artisan class and the middling class, but there's a much poorer undergirdling of our society with new recent immigrant laborers that work for very, very low wages on unskilled, often physically demanding type workforces. And then there's the owners, and there's the industrialists and the capitalists that make the economy flow, and that creates social tension to some degree. The book suggests that the union movement, the labor movement, starts during this era. Yeah, it starts, but it really doesn't take off until the 20th century. So I don't buy that this is really the birth. It's more it's more the fertilization, if you will, or um, the moment of conception of the union movement. But the labor movements really don't have much success until much later on in the 20th century. I shouldn't say much, but it's not that big. But what are the issues? Class conflict, child labor, accelerated immigration, and the expansion of slavery followed as a result of the market revolution. So it's not all good things. Much of it is, but much of it's also detrimental, one could argue. There's also the birth, because of the economies there's money there. The term was called a confidence man back then. Basically, these hucksters that would go out and swindle people on fraudulent investments, and they were pretty rampant back then. Some fascinating stories in that. And that's the term we have now to becoming a con man. If you ever heard that person's a con man, it's from the term confidence man that was born during this era. It came out of a newspaper article back in the 30s or 40s, where these people would go around and sell you on, whether it was gold prospecting or real estate speculation or investing in a company that didn't really exist, and lots of Ponzi schemes. It wasn't called Ponzi till later, but pyramid schemes and things like that were very, very prevalent during this era in American history. Not only did we have a market revolution, we also had a communication revolution, because now we have the telegraph. The ability to send information rapidly grows. One of the major significant aspects, I wish it had its own section in the book, was the creation of the Erie Canal, funded by mostly the state of New York and some private industry as well. Federal government just wasn't into that then. Federal government was like, states, if you guys want to create canals and roads, you do it. The federal government didn't really want to invest in infrastructure the way states did. We still had this concept of states' rights versus federal government, and how much of the role of infrastructure, of roads and canals, should be state-borne, was still in the play back then. It was states took a lot of the action when it came to creating things like the Erie Canal, with private investment and state sponsorship as well. The Erie Canal made the Empire State. There's no question about it, although it was already significant because of New York Harbor, and there was a lot of industry and commerce going on there. Now, because of the Erie Canal, all those products, agricultural products from the Midwest, could be shipped through the waterways right into the port of New York through the canal system. It really, really made them what they were. And I believe, I forgot who the governor of New York was at the time, that announced that this is going to make us the Empire State. And it truly did. By 1840, Ohio also created 2 navigable all-water links to Erie Canal and the Ohio River. This really became significant. In fact, it was sometimes called the Canal Revolution of that era. Canals were made all over the place. In fact, in Massachusetts, there's a whole series of different towns that celebrate their canal history, including Holyoke, where I didn't grow up, but I hung around up in Holyoke when I was a kid sometimes. Huge amount of canals up there. These basically man-made or human-made waterways that connected, because we didn't have automobiles, and the trains were only starting as well too. And so one of the ways of navigation, cheap once made, was the canal system. And many of them went bankrupt, though, because they went a little too crazy on the canal system. In fact, they had canals going all over the place, and they really lead to much, and pretty expensive to build. And if they didn't make a profit after a certain period of time, they'd often go bankrupt. Same with railroads. They started off with public sponsorship, later became totally private. First big barons of industry and finance were born out of the expansion of the railroad industry, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast. The South always lagged behind on infrastructure developments. And part of the argument when we get to the Civil Wars, why didn't they succeed, is because they didn't have the industry or the infrastructure in terms of railways and canals the way that the North and the Midwest had. Yeah, it's interesting. They talk about how the communication revolution happens during this period of time because of Morse code. The Morse code, they can communicate with the dots and dashes, and through the telegraph line, communication became very rapid. Because it's always interesting that Andrew Jackson becomes this great military leader in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was over before the Battle of New Orleans actually happened. It's just fascinating that the information about the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed over in Europe, couldn't get back to the United States to let us know that peace was at hand. And now communication was going. And with communication, people get to share ideas and information and news much more rapidly, and we get a more of a cohesive vision of nationalism, really, through the ability to communicate like that. There's also different ways in which we harvested wheat. There's the horse-drawn mechanical reaper from Silas McCormick that really made the wheat, harvesting of wheat much more economical and much more efficient. And then we have John Deere, the same company as today, the steel-bladed plow. All of these things really created new technologies that were unthought of before. We know just a decade or so before, we had Eli Whitney. He gets all the credit, but there were other cotton gins being created at the time to take out this seed out of the cotton to make the cotton more usable and efficiently, a part of manufacturing process. All of these things changes things. One of the things that's very interesting was the business corporations started creeping up. We used to have corporations that were recognized and applauded, but they were public corporations. They were things to fund things like railroads and canals and things like that. Those were okay. But private corporations were deemed as evil. And I thought I underlined somewhere in the book about maybe it was a previous book I had about how politicians would come out and talk about private corporations as being really taking away rights and liberties from everyday citizens because the power of the corporation would ultimately overshadow that. We still have those arguments today, but they were born out in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. One of the interesting thing that comes up with in terms of government recognition of contract and about commerce and how important it is was the famous case of Dartmouth versus Woodward. It's 1819, and the College of Dartmouth was given by a charter from the King of England, and they're functioning well, but the state of New Hampshire wants to take it over and wants to nullify that charter and make it a state college. And so they sue and they go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court really anchors this philosophy that the sanctity of contract must be protected even from government interference. The government can't just come in and trump a valid contract as long as it's for a legal purpose, just because they see things that might be done differently or better with some other entity or with the government itself. And that case to this day gets cited when the government tries to basically somehow create a rule or principle that interferes with the freedom of contract, a very significant bedrock of our American philosophy is the sanctity of contract and the power of government having to recognize the legitimacy of contract. And we know there's a decline of and I'm going to sound a bit, radical in this regard, but part of the end of Northern slavery is the fact that it is seen as inhumane and it's against our values in the Declaration of Independence and our political philosophy. Part of it is a reality that it's not economically beneficial the way it is in the South. We're not nearly as agrarian, and the Southern labor for not so much tobacco, but for rice and for the big one, king cotton, they call it king cotton because it is the king of the economy, is born on the backs of slavery. And so slavery grows in the South, it weakens in the North. And in fact, many of the states that don't feel they really need the number of slaves that they once did, they would sell them down to Southern plantation owners at great profit. It became the trading of slaves and the buying and selling of slaves was a huge industry in of itself. And that's where that term comes from. If you ever heard the term, I was sold down the river, that's actually a reference to slaves being sold down the river because the Southern communities still needed them, or a huge demand for them, and not so much in the Northeast anymore. But this becomes part of the tension over slavery, is that Southern states have a different culture, different economic foundation, and the Northeast seems to be reaping the profit because they're the middlemen and they're the manufacturers of the textiles later on. But it's also over slavery. There's slavery's in the South, slavery's not in the North. And when there's politicking going on, there's slave states and there's free states, and that creates a political tension that, although slavery is the vehicle, it's regional in nature as well. Look, and I love the corporation things about the whole the anti-slavery anti-incorporation movement early on became much bigger later. And we know the Fugitive Slave Act gets passed during this period of time. Really, a lot of tension starts because it's like the South is basically mandating that the northern states help capture freed slaves, and that creates even greater tension between the South and the North. Change in labor organization. I know it's the seed is getting planted and germinating maybe during this period of time, but it doesn't really take off in big leaps and bounds in this era. And we know the Waltham-Lowell system, will be a test on it, is basically antebellum, means prior to the Civil War. It took off all over New England. It was created right here in Lowell, Massachusetts, where basically the factory system takes place, and it creates huge efficiencies. Many of them were There's whole interesting stories on women that would go there and work for 3 or 4 years so they could afford either education, or they would just do it to help their family during the late teens, early 20s, and they would live in dormitories that were strictly regulated because the morality was still very puritanical in New England. But it's an interesting history how the work was largely guided towards young women during that era, and they often lived on camp, worked long hours, long days, but they did fairly well in terms of benefiting their families. But if you look back, they weren't paid a lot, that's for sure. Um, this concept of free labor comes in now because we have this immigration. Now it's piecemeal work in the factory. What I find fascinating about this, it cuts both ways. In one way, people are lamenting that these people are so poor that even when they work long days and long weeks, they can never get ahead. They barely are surviving. But on the other hand, it's free labor. I can walk away and go find a better job if I'm, have the gumption and the wherewithal. If I could put some money aside, maybe I could start my own company or buy land eventually out west. But the reality is, most people in that era were pretty much stuck in the free labor market. They stayed poor and they stayed impoverished and they stayed deprived. And that creates tension between classes. There's no question about it. But here's what I love, the philosophy of it. And most people love Abraham Lincoln and the things he says. I have a whole story about a quote Abraham Lincoln said that my father hated, which I always found interesting, but it's way off track. But he said this: the man who labored for another last year, meaning I'm working for somebody else, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. This is what we still believe this to this day. This essential belief undergirdled the Northern commitment to free labor and won the market revolution much wide acceptance. It was just this conception because, I'm down and out today and I'm working for peanuts. I'm working for a wage that really keeps me impoverished. But you know what? I'm going to work even harder. I'm going to make more money, and eventually I'm going to save money. I'm going to open up my own little shop or become self-employed. And then eventually I'm going to be the owner. And someday I'll have workers working for me. We still believe that. The irony of the belief is there's truth to it, right? And there's some great stories. I don't know if it's Carnegie or I forgot which one of the great barons started off with next to nothing and became one of the richest Americans of all time, really one of the bedrocks of the Industrial Revolution. But when we hear stories like that, those are the stories that get published. What doesn't get published is the great majority of people stay as laborers, poor laborers, living in very deprived conditions. And until the labor movement of the 20th century, there isn't a recognition that we have to start doing things like, well, it is in this era, capping hourly time unless you get overtime and things like that. But even I believe it. It's the kind of thing. If I hustle, I work hard, I can change my class status from middling to lower, middle, or upper, whatever it is. We all believe that, and or most of us do, great majority of it. But the reality is, it's really tough without some form of equitable pay, living wages for people. And we've come a long way in that direction. But the other argument against is, wait a minute, you're free to go somewhere else. We shouldn't have minimum wages. It should be whatever people are willing to work for. But the problem with that is, if we don't place a ground floor called minimum wage, and if we don't have workers' rights protections, the capitalist system will just be purely seeking profit. And some people say, well, that's okay. Others say, there has to be at least some parameters for it. Otherwise, poor, uneducated laboring classes will never be able to subsist well in American culture. Those tensions really started in this era, I guess, is more important than this. But I love that quote from Abraham Lincoln: the man who labored for another today will next year work for himself. And then the year following that will have workers working for him. And there's some sort of natural evolutional time. I wish that were true for all of us. But let's face it, it's hard to move up in class in that era, especially. Probably easier today, but in that era it was definitely not true. Changes in gender roles. We know women always played an important part in history, but the cult of womanhood was still very strong. Some women did go out and work, but they often worked in industries related to, traditional servants, things of that nature. They did work in textile mills, which was new, but they still never had nearly as significant rights as men. They still weren't recognized the same way. Coverture was still alive and well, meaning The woman's income was owned by her dad if she was unmarried, and if not by her dad, by her husband. But women still played a very significant role in the household. There was an expectation. The cult of womanhood was that women were responsible for the upbringing, the cultivation, the socialization, and the civic inculcation, if you will, of children to be Americans and to be good citizens, to be moral, was the responsibility of women, and they were honored for that, and they were highly respected for that. And when we get into the next chapter, women's influence behind the scenes, if you will, not necessarily in elected office, had a huge impact on Andrew Jackson's cabinet. In fact, Andrew Jackson had to dismiss his whole cabinet over the controversy of all of the wives of the different cabinet members really being difficult on one issue. So, my son has a coffee here for me. Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. I am in the middle of a video conference, but he realized that. So, thank you, Tony. So, the sphere of women. There's a artist rendering the book, and I like that, but they put those things in there. We know the public schools started during this era. It's not too much in this book. I wish it was more in here, but public schools were almost always geared to having women teach. Well, there's a couple different reasons. One reason, I think a good reason, a complementary reason, is women had the patience, the dedication, the calmness, and the detail that was necessary to be elementary school teachers. So during the common school era, mostly in the Northeast, in the Midwest, the South didn't do the public schooling too much in this era. They recruited women to be teachers of these schools. Well, that's one rationale why. The other rationale was women were paid so poorly to teach in these public schools that they saw it fit for their employment. Sad, but the public school did open up. So women were becoming more and more educated. Women were now purchasing clothes as part of the market economy as opposed to making them. That was part of the consumption and period of time. Well, ideals and ideas of marriage changed during this era. No longer were you marrying for sort of this economic status, or would it be appropriate based upon family arrangement. I don't want to call it arranged marriage, but it was a bit like that in that era. You were expected to marry into a family that had backgrounds, and and you wanted your daughters, hopefully your sons too, to marry as highly as they could. This changed in this era. Now the concept of marrying for love became more important. The romantic era is upon us. It's hard to believe, but even in some cultures today, people marry for economic status and societal status, and parents play a great deal of significant roles in whom you are able to choose. Back in this era, it was starting to change. And I think the language is, what do they say? Yeah, marked the beginning of the shift from institutional marriages to compassionate marriage. Love, right? Everybody marries for love. They divorce for lack of it, I guess. I also teach family law. I'm just thinking about we're in the middle of a divorce section. The rise of industrial labor. I'm not buying it entirely yet. It's a start. We know that there was such a huge amount of immigrants, many of them Irish, but there's also German immigrants. There's other nations coming in as well, Africans without their own consent through slavery, right up until 1808. But the illegal slave trade certainly still continued. More than 5 million Americans immigrated between 1820 and 1860. Irish, German, Jewish immigrants were not in huge numbers, but in huge number in terms of their percentage of the world population were significant. And this is the quote I like in terms of giving it some, what does it all mean? What does it really look like? 1/8 of Americans were born outside the United States in 1860. 1/8 of all people inhabiting United States of America. 1/8 of them, that's a significant number, were born outside of the United States. And I like the book called It's a Push and Pull. You're leaving a country because it sucks because of famine or because of oppression, whether it's religion or economic. And in the poll is American streets are paved with gold and it's the land of milk and honey. But there is opportunity here. Some of it's exaggerated, but some of the factories as industry needed workers, they would advertise over in these countries suggesting it was the land of milk and honey, and people got very excited. And if you don't have anything at home, it's time to go. I mean, that's true of immigrants today. Why would you immigrate today to the United States? Because you're trying to flee either oppression or hunger or fear, and you're looking for a better land. If you have both the pull and the push, it obviously makes coming to America very, very exciting. And we had pretty much open immigration during that period of time, except with the Chinese and a little bit later the Japanese. And it changes during this era because there's so many immigrants, especially Southern Germans and Irish. They tended to be Catholic, and Catholics were very much viewed with disdain by the largely puritanical Protestant foundations of our country. It was really a huge backlash as a result of the immigration. Um, Between 1840 and 1860, 1.7 million Irish fled the famous potato famine, if you know about it. Um, it was a staple of their diet in Ireland. But it was more than just the potato famine. The tension with English rule in Ireland made it difficult for Irish farmers to produce their goods, so they often just didn't farm the land. It was a complex story, but it was famine. And if you got enough money, it's time to get the heck out of there. And where do they come? They come to the United States. And there's already some previous generations here, so there was sort of a, I want to say there's a welcome wagon, but there's people of your historical origins are living in America. I just read another biography of John F. Kennedy, the best I've ever read. And what I like about it doesn't focus so much on his presidency or his assassination. It focuses on his lineage, and it talks about his great grandparents and how both on both sides, on his maternal side and his paternal side, immigrated from different sections of Ireland during famine and crisis. I believe there was one point. I know there was one point. I believe it's right about the Civil War that there's more Irish people in the United States than in Ireland. They became very prolific here in the United States. Um, yeah. And here's what happens. Like with and we still have this problem with the way we view immigration in the country. It's a mixed view. We applaud it on one side, and the other side we are fearful of it. And I'm saying we globally, it's a phenomenon that's happened throughout history. In this period of time, the 1830s through right up to the Civil War and beyond, because there's going to be another influx during the next turn of the century of Irish immigrants that even create a bigger backlash. But during this period of time, it says here the sudden influx of immigration triggered a backlash among many native-born Anglo-Protestant Americans. They're called nativists because they feel like they're natives. Clearly not. Native Americans are natives, but nativists in terms of, we've been here longer, so therefore we're here first, became very big, and it was especially against the Catholic presence. The anti-Catholicism sought to limit European immigration and prevent Catholics from establishing churches and other institutions and participating in society. That tension was in Boston, even in the election when John F. Kennedy ran against Henry Cabot Lodge for the U.S. Senate seat. He's the Brahmin, he's the Anglo-Protestant, and the Kennedy is the Irish Catholics, who still had a lot of tension with the rich Mayflower sect, if you will, in the Boston suburbs. A very, very interesting history there. Good book. If you want to know the name of it, let me know. It's fantastic. Unions didn't become legally accepted. They were feared as being interfering with contract. They were not very popular. They were often seen as troublemakers in this era. They did not become much bigger and more acceptable until the 20th century, but they did start at this period of time. There's a case out of Massachusetts in 1842 that recognized them as legitimate and legal. Many of the women started many of the legal, or would I say the legal tools of boycott and walkouts. They were doing it in the textile mills because they felt they were being treated fairly. Women are often found to be in the leading forefront of many of these social movements, but they were almost all unsuccessful during this era. You walk out, you don't come back, you're fired. Just get new people to come in, and so they weren't. The thing is, because it was free labor, I didn't see my brother and sister working in the factory as kind of being in the same boat, because I'm getting off this boat later. I'm going to open up my own company. I'm going to be okay. The identity of seeing ourselves with a unified problem that we need to fight together and unify just wasn't galvanizing the labor movement in this era. It wasn't. The book seems to suggest it was. I don't buy it. It comes later. Yeah, Pennsylvania started a law in 1847. Child welfare laws start to come into play over work. We know the horror shows. They're showing photographs of little kids climbing through these complex machines, getting freaking killed, for crying out loud. It was really women that were concerned about child labor and passing laws. And they can really be seen as the start of the labor movement in many ways, because they were. But the labor movement doesn't galvanize until much later. But that's pretty much it on chapter 8. Dry kind of material, I think, in some respects, but important. And hopefully you get a little something out of this video. I know I was surprised a couple students wanted me to put it up, so I did.